trouble-free life is a desirable kind of life. A good life is free from difficulty. Trouble is to be regretted and avoided. Not so, not so, not so. We must learn to profit from trouble. We must learn somehow to turn trouble into treasure and problems into prosperity. And you can afford to lose your job. You didn't think so, but you can. You can afford to have an automobile collision. You can afford to go bankrupt. You can afford to be sick, but you cannot afford to pity yourself. The famous missionary, the Apostle Paul, was a man who had some chronic infirmity. We read about it in his second letter to the church at Corinth, where he talks about his thorn in the flesh. No use debating what it was, but it was some kind of physical malady that plagued him all his days. But he learned to live with it. And what does he say here? He said that he heard the Lord say to him, "My grace is sufficient for thee, and my strength is made perfect in weakness." So he says, then I would rather glory in my infirmity. He was not moaning about it, complaining about his physical problem, but he was rejoicing in it and praising God for it. And that's what has to be learned. There was a godly man who lived in the 1600s in France, Fenelon, and he left many of his letters behind, and they are rich for spiritual help and godliness. Here's Fenelon. Outward sufferings would not be really painful if we were exempt from those within. The within sufferings he's talking about. It's self-pity and murmuring and complaining, moaning about our difficulties. Let's keep going with Fenelon. Here he says, this trial, provided your will is faithful, is useful. The trial, useful, he says. It may be a great good to you. It may teach you humility and distrust of yourself. It may be making you conscious of your weakness and lead you to put your whole trust in God. Oh my. So, says Fenelon, the bad things can be good. Adversity can be a blessing. Loss can be a gain. Adversity can lead to prosperity. You see, it comes down to this. It's not what happens to us. It is how we react to what happens to us. And that's what's important. So we all pick up some trouble in life. Some troubles, sadly, we bring on ourselves. We find no one to blame. Usually we look around for someone to blame and even try to blame God for our difficulties, our troubles, our infirmities, our losses in life. But no, no. No matter what comes into our lives, it's how we handle it, how we respond to it that counts. It can be terrible. It can be even tragic. But if somehow you respond to it in a positive way, it will turn out to be good for yourself. That's what Paul says. My infirmities, he finds Christ's grace sufficient. And he says, I will glory in my infirmities. So learn to triumph in the midst of trouble. Learn to turn problems into possibilities. In other words, take hold of life instead of complaining, instead of blaming, instead of wondering, why me? Then react positively. And so it will be a blessing to you. It's Dale Carnegie in one of his books who tells about a farmer who bought a farm in Florida. But it was a sad experience. He couldn't grow anything on the land. It was not productive. And all that seemed to grow was scrub oak, and the whole property was infested with rattlesnakes. How could you find a situation that would be worse than all of that? But he reacted to it in a good way, a pleasant way, a profitable way. He killed rattlesnakes, and he canned the meat and started selling it. And I don't know who would buy it, but there was a big market for it, he found. And so it was being shipped all over. And then he found that the venom from the snakes could be shipped to laboratories, and used for an antitoxin, the venom from the snakes. And so he had, from the poison, he had profit as he sold it to the labs who used it for a positive result. And then the skins of those rattlesnakes. There was a real market for those as they were turned into shoes and handbags for women who wanted exotic accessories and were able to pay for them, these expensive rattlesnake skins, for their shoes, for their purses. And now, the day that Dale Carnegie visited that farm, he picked up the 20,000 tourists has visited in the previous year, all paying an entrance fee. So you wonder what you do with rattlesnakes and a farm infested with them. Well, you make it work for you, and you turn it to good, rather than complaining, griping, and feeling sorry for yourself all along the way. There are all kinds of things that are unpleasant that come into our lives. We say we're stressed out. I want to go back to the Apostle Paul again and think about him. Paul was without question a great man. He traveled constantly, on foot mostly, so it was a tedious thing. And Paul the Apostle planted churches in the key cities of the Roman Empire. So by the time he was executed by the Emperor Nero, the major cities in the Roman Empire had churches that were started by the Apostle Paul. And then he wrote letters to these churches. Do you realize half the books of the New Testament were written by the Apostle Paul? What a life, well, you say. So he got a lot done. He must have had an easy time of it. To my knowledge, there is no biography written on the Apostle Paul. But in his second letter to the church at Corinth, there are little snippets of autobiography where he draws back the curtain for a moment and tells us something private, something personal about himself. And I'm open to one of those in 2 Corinthians, where we are in the 11th chapter of that letter to the church at Corinth. And he tells some of his experiences. He says in verse 24, from the Jews should have claimed him as a hero. Instead, they beat him up. He says, 5 times received I stripes from the Jews, 40. And then thrice, he says, was I beaten. Oh, we think he was a great man. When he was alive, they wanted to get rid of him. Thrice was I beaten. Once was I stoned. That was at Lystra. They threw rocks at him until he fell, and they thought he was dead, but he wasn't. And then 3 times I suffered shipwreck. That was on the Mediterranean. We read about one of those shipwrecks that he experienced in the 27th chapter of the book of Acts. Poor Paul, where he's trying to walk from one place to the other, and when he found it advantageous to take a ship, there were no passenger ships at that time, you understand, just freighters, most of them hauling wheat from Egypt, the city of Alexandria, to Rome to feed the people in the world's largest city at that time, about 1 million folk. And he says, 3 times I was shipwrecked. Paul the Apostle had a hard life. Yet he accomplished a great deal. If any one of us would do just a smidgen, just a tiny bit of what the Apostle Paul accomplished, we would really rejoice. But he did it in spite of problems, in spite of difficulty, in spite of all these tragedies that befell him during his life. And instead of just being stressed out and feeling sorry for himself because he was beaten, because he was stoned, because he was shipwrecked, here I am trying to serve God and nobody appreciates me. No. He just kept plowing on and did well. And it's amazing how God will take our failures and turn them into successes. In the 14th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, we have the record of a long, hard day of Jesus and his disciples. And as that day closed, Jesus said he wanted to be alone. He wanted to go up into a mountain to pray and to have fellowship with his Father after being harassed by people all day long. He didn't even want to be with his disciples. And he put them in a boat and told them to go sailing on the Sea of Galilee, which they could easily do because they were all fishermen, of course. And so it is that when they went out to sea, the Sea of Galilee, surrounded on the east and the west by mountains and being 600 feet below sea level, was subject to storms. And one of these violent, raging storms came up while they were on the sea. And then, to top it off, they are frightened out of their wits, for they see Jesus coming, or who was it? They hardly know. Walking on the water. Oh, they thought it was a spirit, a ghost of some kind. And Jesus called out to them to not be afraid. And Peter said, Lord, if it's you, let me come to you walking on the water. Jesus said, come on. And Peter, he's out of the boat and he's walking on the water. Amazing. What an experience that any one of us would cherish. But he blew it. Instead of looking at Jesus, he started looking around at the waves and feeling the pressure of the howling wind, and he started to sink. So it looked like it was the end of Peter in the midst of the storm. But in the midst of Peter's failure, Jesus stretched out his hand to Peter, who took it, and he lifted Peter back up as they walked on the water back into the boat. Yes, it's Jesus who takes our troubles and turns them into triumph. It's Jesus who'll solve your problem in maybe some miraculous way if you let him. But do not get swamped by your difficulties or drown in your troubles. One of the most painful experiences in life is being let down by people that we have trusted. Someone you thought was a good friend turned against you. Someone you thought was honest lied to you. Someone, even a family member who should have been close to you, somehow turned against you and hated you and let you down. Those wounds are deep. But it was David in the 27th Psalm who said, when my father and mother, people you would normally trust in any situation, when my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will take me up. So there's no situation, no matter how terrible, how adverse, but the Lord will help you in the midst of it if you turn to him. Yes. Now, you notice some things. There are two books in the Bible on suffering. The scripture does not ignore suffering. Job is one who went through a terrible experience of losing everything he had, even his children, and then finally his health. And what he wished he had lost, his wife, who berated him, she seems to be doing fine. But Job suffered, but God was with him and brought him through it. And not only that, but rewarded him. The other book on suffering is Peter. And he has written a couple letters. We find them toward the end of our New Testament, 1 Peter and 2 Peter. And in the 4th chapter of his first letter, he talks about problems and trouble of all kinds. Verse 12, think it not strange, he writes to his people, the fiery trial which has come to test you. And rejoice, he says, as much as you are partakers of Christ's suffering. A fiery trial and rejoice? Yes, he does. And that's what he did, and it works. So do not lose your good, positive thinking when life seems to fall apart, even with fiery trials. So you see, it is not what happens to you. It's how you react to what happens to you. Do you remember the same water that drowned thousands and thousands and thousands of people? We read about this in Genesis 6 and 7. The same water that drowned all these people was the water that floated the boat occupied by Noah, his wife, his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. So while multitudes are drowning in the water, these 8 people who obeyed God and did what he said, these 8 people were being rescued, saved by the same water that destroyed the others. So was it with Noah. Then you always want to think about Joseph. You talk about someone who was mistreated, abused, kicked around. Joseph, starting in chapter 37 of the first book of the Bible, Genesis. Oh my. He was the youngest of these 12 brothers, and they hated him, despised him. He had contributed a little bit to that, but that still did not excuse them. They were his brothers, and they should have been nice to him, but they didn't care about him. They just despised Joseph. They were out tending their father's sheep, Jacob's sheep. And Jacob sent Joseph with some parcels of food for them, for they were at a distance finding pasturage for those sheep. Oh, well, when his brothers saw him coming, they said, this is our opportunity. His father, who loves him so much, is not around, and we'll take care of him. First, they were going to throw him in a pit, but then they felt they had a better idea, and they decided to sell him to some Arabs. So Joseph is involved in human trafficking. sold to these Arabs who are on their way to a marketplace down in Egypt. And so it is that he ends up sold in the market, the slave market in Egypt. Joseph, who had the special coat, who had a special place in the heart of his father, is now in a foreign country, sold. He ends up in Potiphar's house, but there Potiphar's wife lies about him, and he's thrown in prison. Oh, how can life turn so bad in such a chain of bad events? Hated by his brothers, sold as a slave, trafficked again in an Egyptian slave market, and then actually going down into Egypt and in prison. But God has his hand upon him. He was faithful to the Lord. And what happens? He ends up in the number 2 spot, just under Pharaoh, in the land of Egypt. He triumphs over his troubles. And a prison is but a stepping stone to a great opportunity to be the number 2 ruler over the land of Egypt. Or Daniel. Daniel, in his early teens, became a prisoner of war, landed in the land of Babylon, and yet rose to the top. And there, in the land of Babylon, was right at the very top of the rulers under the emperor Nebuchadnezzar. Amazing how God turns these troubles into triumph and takes these problems and solves them in a remarkable way. Yes, there was another man who lived in France who was Brother Lawrence, who was a godly man. And it was Brother Lawrence who said, "Let us then worship God in our infirmities, offering to him our sorrows, just when they press upon us, asking him lovingly, give us strength and mold our lives to his."